Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Incubator Podcast. We are back today for a special interview on the Incubator Podcast. We are joined by three esteemed neonatologists. We have the pleasure of having on the podcast today Dr. John Zupancic, Dr. Susanna Hay, and Dr. Roger Soll. John, Susanna, Roger, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
For the people who may not be familiar with our guest, and shame on you for that, Dr. John Zupancic is Associate Chief of Neonatology at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Med School. He also directs the EPOC program, which leads clinical research in neonatology at his institution. Dr. Roger Soll is the H. Wallace Professor of Neonatology at the University of Vermont and Vice President of the Vermont-Oxford Network, where he directs network clinical trials and follow-up. He's also coordinating editor of the Cochrane Neonatal Library. And Dr. Susanna Hay is a clinical neonatologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Boston Children's Hospital. And you are also an instructor in pediatrics at Harvard Med School. I'm thrilled to have them on the show today. And we have the pleasure of having you on to discuss the release of a brand new book called 50 Studies Every Neonatologist Should Know. This is the book. It is published by Oxford University Press. It's a phenomenal book. It's a book that Daphna and I have been talking about for some time. It's a book that needed to be written, and we're so excited to finally have it in print and have a copy. So my first question, I guess, this book was also, I think it's important to mention that this book is a collection of summaries of important research papers published in the field of neonatology, and it is edited by our three guests, but also you guys were joined by Dr. Barbara Schmidt and Dr. Haresh Kirpalani, and it's already amazing that we got you three on the call. So I can't even imagine if we had to coordinate schedules for 5 possible guests. John, I wanted to start with you. What was maybe the why behind this book? I think people should know that it's part of a larger series aimed at helping clinicians identify the most impactful research in their field. And this book is specifically designed for the neonatology community. Can you tell us what motivated you to bring this to neonatology specifically? Was there a moment, maybe as a trainee or even as an educator, where you realized that there was a real need for a resource like this?
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Ben. That's a really important question, because even beyond the content of the book, I think the question highlights something that we think is one of the big remaining challenges in evidence-based practice, evidence-based medicine now, which is this idea of knowledge dissemination and knowledge translation. There are people doing great trials, but trying to get those into the hands of clinicians in a digested way, in a way that helps them to make decisions at the bedside is really important, and it's really challenging. There are 200 to 400 randomized trials published annually. And we're pretty good at getting through those, thanks in large part to the new technologies, thanks to your podcast, for example, where you're able to go through 6 or 8 per week and put them on the table for people. Thanks to ED-Neo, for example, that's figured out a way to use social media to get information out. But even here, with all of that, and with our faculty and fellows have 3 journal clubs a month of various descriptions. Some with waffles and some with lunch, and even with doing that, we cannot get through everything we need to in the contemporaneous trials, like the ones that are coming out now. So, we continue to try to do that with new work that's being produced. But years ago, another nuance to that came up with this realization that if you're around, if you're practicing at the time that a trial is released, you hear about it through one of these mechanisms. You go to a scientific conference and you hear about it, and you hear about the challenges that were faced or the innovations that the trial brought online. And you remember that as you're maybe incorporating the intervention that the trial looked at into your practice, right? But it's really hard to do that going backwards. So when we say, as we do almost every week, if you say, "Oh, I'm going to put this baby on the on the DART protocol, like how many new practitioners necessarily know that that trial was stopped early and that it was only based on 70 babies and that the well-meaning information that came out from, or directives that came out from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Canadian Pediatric Society actually slowed down or made much more challenging recruitment to that trial. Or, if we're thinking about the generalizability of the therapeutic hypothermia, if you weren't here when Helix was released, you might not know that. So how do we ensure that people understand the strength of evidence for current practice that is based on studies that happened before? How many of those studies are there? Well, between 2003 and 2022, there are 5,600 randomized trials. So the possibility of surfacing that is just about, impossible for any particular set of trials. You might see them in guidelines, but you have to read the footnotes and so on. So that was part of this issue of kind of going backwards and looking at studies. The second thing is a little more kind of romantic, I guess. And it's this idea that when neonatology started, it was a blank slate. And somebody had to kind of establish this whole new field of evidence at the bench and at the bedside with human studies. And so this incredibly rich history deserves to be brought up. And there's a great deal of learning that can happen around how people attacked those questions. And I've also, at about the same time that we were starting to think about this, I was giving a talk and mentioned Mary Ellen Avery's name, and there were blank faces. It was early career folks, and I asked, how many people have heard of Mel Avery, and I'd say like less than 10% of the room put up their hands, and I thought, well, that's too bad. Like that's really these people were really extraordinary individuals. How do we get them all the recognition, and how do we use them as role models in absentia? So we started this thing. This is all it's you referred to verbose, that might apply to me, but we started this thing called the 52 and 52 RCT challenge back in the about 10 years ago or so. This was a Twitter campaign where we released one trial publication a week with a couple of little notes and sometimes a link to something historical about the impact that it had. And it was a little contest where if people read all 52, they got a Starbucks card, and the fellowship program that had all of its fellows reading all 52 got a pizza party. That ended up being Duke, by the way. I don't know if they got their pizza.
If you are at Duke and you're listening, we will put the contact
Yeah,
information in the.
exactly. So that was fine. That was lots of fun, and there was a little bit of conversation in social media about these various trials. But then it just it evaporates, and we started thinking, well, how can we make this more permanent? And that's where this book comes.
Thank you for that. Roger, I wanted to maybe ask you a little bit about something that John just mentioned, which is that when trials do come out, we tend to pay a lot of attention to them in the moment. And we rarely do this work of going back and seeing the place that a trial maybe holds along the neonatology timeline. And I think that this book is so good for that, because we can actually go back to a trial like John mentioned, the DART trial from Lex Doyle, and see, well, where does the evidence stands now, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, where what was the evidence like, and then put it in context of other papers. Can you tell us a little bit the importance of doing that, and to look at the data in real time, but also then retrospectively going back and reviewing what is the level of the evidence that has influenced practice?
So, Ben, it's a great question. And one of the joys of doing this project was, as John alluded to, which was going back historically. There are studies that span 70 years of neonatology that are included in this book, some of them being truly seminal trials that sent us down the whole road of doing this type of evidence-based medicine. And I don't think our colleagues are aware of the contributions of people like Bill Silverman. And what we do on a daily basis that relates back to work that he's done. The humidity or heat that we use in incubators dates right back to Bill, but so do the fundamental questions about how do we know what we know. And so it was fantastic. There are studies in this book that predate any involvement I had in medicine. From my childhood, there are studies in this book that John and Susanna may think are archaic, that I remember well when they were introduced as a fellow, that influenced my practice. But I think, like John was alluding to, at the bedside now, it's just all there. Like, oh yeah, we screen at 6 weeks for ROP. We do this, and not understanding that basic issue. And so these were mostly the building blocks. We didn't take a lot of the follow-up studies that you're referring to, Ben. But you're right, there's a rich matrix of studies. Certainly our work at Cochrane tries to explore that. But we chose sort of studies that were paradigms, that were either the first or the breakthrough that led to that whole building of the evidence. It is surprising, we could have really looked chronologically at the studies, how much the methodologies change and the expectations around methodologies change. The sophistication of the outcome measures and the analyses of the measures really are quite dynamic. So I think there's a lot that people learn about the whole landscape of trials from the book.
Thank you. Susanna, I wanted to maybe ask you a little bit about the structure of the book, because in a way it reads almost like a spoken narrative. And as a podcaster, I loved the pacing of the book. And I'm wondering if that was really intentional in making it feel like a conversation for people who haven't seen the inside of the book. Obviously, the each chapter, I guess, is a specific study, and it's structured in a very consistent manner, asking what is the research question, why was the study done. It has the years, it has the location, it has the number of patients, it goes through the results. There's a commentary, there's like an editorial with almost every paper, where basically there's called criticisms and limitation. I thought that section was very interesting. And as a podcaster, I love the last section, which is the conversation with the trialist, where when available, you went back to the first author and asked some questions. Can you tell us a little bit from an educational standpoint, because I feel like this book is so valuable for trainees and young career neonatologists. What was the thought process behind structuring the book in this manner?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we started, we got kind of the rough template of the 50 studies series from Oxford, and essentially they let us use that as guidance. So we got to play with it some. And I think one of the biggest additions we did was this interview section that you mentioned. And I think it came quite quickly to our team when we began discussing all these different studies and what we wanted to do, what we wanted to represent, that there's so much more of a conversation around these studies, as we've been talking about, than just kind of their printed form and their analysis, and how those studies continue, and there's more dialogue around it. And we wanted to give the trialists, when available, the opportunity to answer some of these questions that keep coming up, and give us some more detail around kind of the publication, other thoughts they had, and thoughts for the future of their research. So it's easily one of our favorite sections, and it really enriched the product, I think, for us.
Yeah, I think that as we were mentioning earlier, specifically in the DART trial, when Lex Doyle mentions that basically it was hard to complete the study because everybody was steroid dependent. I mean, that is such an insight that you don't really get from the paper, but you get this sort of perspective from the first author years down the road. It's so interesting to see that while we're trying to study, the field may move faster than science would dictate. And I think that's so cool to even know about that.
Ben, if I can interject.
Please.
One of the fun parts of this, in terms of getting those Susanna was great about getting pithy comments at the end, but
Yeah.
there was a lot of conversation around it amongst the editorial team, amongst Barb and Haresh and the three of us. And also, not to be forgotten, individual sections are written by the current trialists, mid-career and some late-career folks who have a unique perspective in the 21st century about trials, and they weighed in. So we had lots of opinions going, and kudos to Susanna for distilling it down to, okay, what's the gem here?
Yeah.
After all of this discussion, I think she did a beautiful job of that.
Oh, that's true. We were always up against the word count. It was, I mean, each of these chapters was so rich because not only did we have this interview section from the trialists, we also had this incredible dream team of contributing authors who are in their own rights experts in these fields, who would then comment on it and talk about all the different research going on and how they thought it could be strengthened and how it should be interpreted. So it was, editing was one of the hardest jobs, trying to
Yeah,
cut this down and make this into like this book that you can carry around.
like sometimes you buy these movies on DVD and you can get the director's cut. I would love to have like all the unedited stuff and see where everybody's comments were. I think that would be it's very nerdy, but I think it would be very cool to know. Roger, I wanted to go back because you did mention Dr. Bill Silverman, and I think that this is such an important point because one of the legacy that Dr. Silverman left the community is that questions should be asked for our babies and questions should be investigated in a very rigorous manner. I think that if we are so attached to following randomized control trial approach to clinical questions in neonatology, it is in great part thanks to him. I mean, I would highly recommend everybody reads his book, Where's the Evidence? I mean, it's just a must. That that being said, in the introduction to the book, you do mention that RCTs, while scientifically rigorous, have inherent limitations, and that we've seen over the years the introduction of other modalities in terms of studying clinical questions, whether these are observational studies, other forms of trials. And the book does not really limit itself to a specific trial type. Can you tell us a little bit about how do we welcome a more diverse form of trial design, and how do we tease out the trials that are actually done well and are answer questions in a valuable way?
That's a wonderful question. In no way is this book trying to say that all those other sources of evidence are irrelevant to our practice. If anything, we're trying to reclaim the birthright of RCTs in this very rich environment now of evidence, all of which contributes to our practice. Towards the specifics of your question, though, trials have sort of peaked, whether it's a COVID phenomenon or whether or not it's an energy and funding phenomenon. They have steadily increased in the past 2 decades, but they're sort of peaking in number. And I think we need to see more trials, and we need to see more innovative trials. Um, some of the issues that really represent the current state of trials, the use of cluster trials, okay, understanding that when we want to look at complex interventions, that probably the institution and center really is the major site. The platform trial, where we can build multiple trials about our practices and generate evidence at a faster pace. One criticism of all the trials in 50 studies is almost every trial is underpowered. Okay. I'm not so sure we sent that message out. We could have written it in every chapter. You know? Then you would be interviewing us, Ben. You would say that was one boring book. But I think if anything, we see it as a need to continue this effort in the 21st century. And you're right, we don't really go into the fact that perhaps we need to think of even different approaches to the randomized trial to make this a really valid and important contribution. I'd be very curious what John and Susanna have to say.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, it's interesting. This is a little bit like a photo album, and you don't know what trials are going to look like. Almost immediately after we kind of wrapped up the proofs, there was much more talk about platypus trial. Like there's platform trials are coming on board, and other trial designs are coming on board, and so this idea of moving the field forward on a base that was innovative in its day. There's a lot of innovation in that's described in those 50 studies, but moving it forward is so important. And I think it comes back to this issue that you had brought up earlier about conversations, right? That we see the actual studies that are fairly succinct in their publication. The word limits are very strict. But the conversation around them tends to happen in the back rooms. There's 10 minutes or 15 minutes at the scientific conferences, And then there aren't really a lot of places where you can talk about where should this go, where is this going, other than in the hallways of those conferences. So I think trying to facilitate that. In the old days, there were a lot more letters to the editor, for example, saying, well, this would have been great as a cluster trial. Maybe we should do that. So I completely agree with you, Roger. I think we need to figure out a way of pushing for that kind of innovation in methodology. And I'm not sure where that push is necessarily going to happen, but it deserves thinking about.
One of the interesting things we could have added is what was left out of the trials. So, I mean, for example, you look at the cooling trials, and they are fantastic, but they're a very strict population, treated in a very strict window. Um, and, we are still struggling with what we should do with the child who has mild hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. And I think we probably do know more about duration and depth now because of the NIH work. But, trials are stereotypic and specific, and we could have written reams about all the unanswered questions that deserve further trials. A separate book.
I know. We kept talking about what's our next spin-off, all the different things we could have done, all the different kind of other trials we might want to look into. So certainly a fun idea for a spin-off, thinking about different ways to approach topics and how to interpret these trials that are so much newer to a lot of us.
My next question for you guys is related to something that Roger brought up in terms of understanding the timeline of studies. First of all, I was shocked sometimes to see how some studies were completed in an efficient manner. I believe that some of the SOCSTAT studies, 4 years done from initiation to publication. It's very impressive. Some others, almost a decade. I think that it's what I mean, and again, like you guys said, every word was accounted for in this book. And so to leave that information, I found it very valuable. But what does that say about the importance of understanding how long it took for a study to go from inception to completion? Can you guys talk a little bit more about that? I'm going to let John take this one and then we'll go around.
Um, yeah, well, I think you summarized what we took away about efficiency of trial design. In order to answer more questions, we have to have more efficient trials. And the idea that because of the constraints of sometimes, regulatory oversight, sometimes funding, sometimes it's our conception of trials that the person with the good idea doesn't necessarily have a patient population. And so they're trying to get as many patients enrolled in answering a question as possible, but it just takes years and years and years.
Or COVID.
Exactly, COVID. Although, interestingly, one of the most efficient trials that or trial ideas came out of COVID, which was the adult platform trial in the UK, right? That was an incredible contribution, I think, methodologically and obviously in terms of the questions it answered because of necessity. But I would argue that it isn't just COVID that's the necessity. It's the issue that you brought up, that if we ask a question, it takes 10 years to answer it. That's putting a lot of babies potentially at risk of either a therapy that isn't good or a therapy that should be in practice and isn't yet. The piece after it is also really important. Once you have a trial that has shown something, in order to get it into guidelines for professional societies, that can sometimes take 3, 4, 5 years to get it, put out by the AAP, for example. So I think this going back to this idea of platform trials, it's a way of improving efficiency and improving the timeline. I think there are other ways to do that, but it's got to be addressed. I agree.
Yeah, and there's some chapters where it doesn't mention maybe there's like, oh, the trial begin date was not stated, and then it gets me wondering, like, I'm wondering how long that took. When did they begin exactly? Susanna, do you have any thoughts on trial periods and how long
Oh,
and how fair some of them?
absolutely. So I think it was fun when we were putting the book together to see kind of within these sections how the timeline worked out between some studies. You'd see like one study really struggling with equipoise, having to kind of change the way they're doing it, and then another study doing a randomized trial several years later. So different approaches and how we actually can answer a question for our field was fascinating to watch. And also, I think in the discussion section, these trials are so difficult to run. I think we were very purposefully critical, largely just to talk about how we can trust these studies, how we can interpret them, but also pointing out that it's all in the real world. So every study is going to have some limitations and how hard these teams are all working to minimize that.
Coming back to that issue of recruitment that you brought up, Susanna, I also wonder how the a climate of trust or distrust in the scientific process might start to work in here. I think it was Roger will know the answer to this, but I think Bill Silverman was the person who said, "For every baby a trial, and for every trial a baby." And I think that there was a period of time where that seemed to be becoming an accepted mode. And I do worry going forward if it's going to be more difficult rather than less to get consent for this process, which is, I don't know the solution, but
Trust is at an all-time low, so I wouldn't be surprised, unfortunately, if recruitment required more effort and more time. Roger, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with John. I mean, I wish that we were like the pediatric oncology group, where literally, the vast majority of patients are seen in the context of the next trial. The trials build on themselves and answer nuanced questions. They don't just say, this worked. Now they want to know which dose and when, and can we minimize, et cetera. So the idea that somehow, and probably through cluster designs, every baby can be involved. One thought I had, and this is far from a criticism of the book, I don't know if there's one shred of evidence in the book that helps us understand how to manage the 22 to 24 week gestation baby. Okay. I mean, that's just the nature of the timeline you were alluding to, Ben.
And it's also not like that data is available out there either.
Oh, no. We didn't miss it, Ben. We didn't miss it. Okay. But I think it's quite notable that in this historical perspective, we have huge gaps, and we need to address that as we move forward. And as I think John was alluding to, it's going to have to be a more innovative approach that involves whole populations and engages families and lay people in the process, in embracing that we cannot move forward further without their assistance and their input. So yeah.
So along those lines, and something you mentioned before, one other thing that stood out to me is sometimes for certain papers how far back these studies go, and it doesn't seem like you guys set a limit on the search function of your studies by date. And going back, for example, in the hematology section on the study for vitamin K, we're looking at a study that was done in the mid '60s, and that's pretty bold, especially in an area where a lot of us now are saying, oh, the population was so different at that time, and the tools that we had available were very different. My question is, how did you assess the value of these very early trials, and were there any concerns that maybe the care context, the technology, even the diagnostic definitions might have changed? And are there any enduring lessons that those early efforts actually provide and still remain to today?
Well, K is a great example because it does belong. Term babies are still term babies. Breastfeeding is still breastfeeding. And vitamin K deficiency still exists. And in fact, it looked at clinical outcomes, not surrogates and biochemical outcomes. It's a beauty and great for people to know how Sutherland did that historically. So love that it's there. On the other hand, if we looked at CPAP studies, okay, the earliest ones are in big babies, 34-week gestation babies, no steroids, little experience from nursing staff. What can you glean from that in today's practice? So we tried to pick studies, if they were historical, that either methodologically changed our approach, so some of the Silverman studies, or ones that were like so tried and true that we do it every day in our practice, and we don't necessarily know where that came from. But you're right; it's a challenge, and people would argue that maybe the most recent evidence is the only trustworthy evidence for our babies.
Susanna, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a great question. And I remember the vitamin K chapter specifically, Anna Curley commenting on this is some interesting language used in this manuscript because it was just so old. But I think that was one of the challenges in our books, finding kind of which study to represent. But we'd always comfort ourselves with we have the like related studies section. So we try to pull that study into kind of how it go is relevant currently to our field and whether studies kind of built off of that and went further with this information. So it was hard to not include some of the more current studies on topics, but we tried to find kind of what we felt was the biggest seminal piece in many cases.
John, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this subject and also maybe expand a little bit on that question. Do you think that we're too quick to discard the past? I mean, the scientific method has been rigorously followed for many, many years, and our predecessors have sometimes addressed the question in a very rigorous manner. Should we not be discarding old data the way we're currently doing it, which I think is quite aggressive?
That's interesting because as Susanna and Roger were talking, and as I was listening to your question, I was thinking, one of the issues there is that we included studies as they alluded to that broke new ground, but the issue comes up like either it broke new ground and just established something and it's unlikely to change. I think K is like that, vitamin K. But sometimes you're dealing with a different population of patients, and the question comes up not so much about discarding the information from the past, but when do we ask the question again? And not even necessarily with any nuance to it, but just or tweaking to it, but just same question, different era, where BPD is a completely different beast compared to 1989 when Roger was starting his surfactant trials. And so I think it's the short answer is, I guess, that there's no simple rule about when to discard the past. I think we have to be aware of what our evidence is based on, and that translates practically into always in any guideline having the certainty of evidence assessed, and every recommendation has a certainty of evidence attached to it from whatever kind of study is done, trial or not, that we understand based on the footnotes when that information was done. Is it directly relevant to our patients? Is it indirect because it's old? And then somebody, thinks about when to re-ask a question. And then importantly, the funding has to be there to re-ask that question, because I think sometimes people say, well, this isn't innovative. It was something that was established in 1992. Do we really need to go back and see who needs surfactant these days?
Yeah, surfactant is a good example on that, though, John, because we did the first trials in the 80s, but the trials comparing our approaches of aggressive prophylactic care versus later treatment of established disease were done in the 90s. Very low rates of antenatal steroids, very little use of CPAP. Those studies had a very strong effect on decreasing mortality in pneumothorax. When repeated by Vermont Oxford Network, by the NICHD in a more current population, in fact, the opposite effect is seen. So it's not a trivial question, and we have to think about where, like milk cartons, studies have expired and need to be discarded. But you have to think carefully, because there's a lot of resources, as you noted, John. It's a very costly process to say, when do we need to ask this again, and do we have equipoise to ask it again?
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because I was trying to understand the process of putting this book together, and I'm assuming then that you guys pick 50 studies that are going to enter the book, and once the writing process begins, do you guys have someone checking that no more studies is coming out that might actually trump the ones that you currently are working on? Because it sounds like a terrifying process where you're finishing one, it's like, oh shoot, something else come up. So I guess my question is that in a way, this book does capture a moment in time, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. And is there any tension knowing this? And maybe is the book format something that is even scary to even approach, especially as the book goes to print? This landscape continues to evolve at a very fast pace, as you guys mentioned earlier. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that. I'm going to let Roger take this first.
No, I'm going to pass it to Susanna.
Go
She,
ahead.
she,
Or
she,
Susanna.
Nothing would have been gotten done if she didn't herd us into this. So
Okay, go ahead, Susanna.
Oh my gosh, that was it was a fun little race we were trying to do, and this book ended up taking us quite a while to put together because every chapter went through every editor. We wanted each chapter to be meaningful and well written and thoughtful and fully represent kind of these trials. So in the background, we were getting these magnificent studies getting published all the time. Um, and this is after, I mean, to go back to just selecting the studies, it took us months, I think at least 6 months to wean down to 50 studies. We tried to do it as objectively as possible, doing huge searches on kind of number of citations. Studies had high-level journals. We have our own database that Jay-Z and I are working on. So just finding the biggest trials there and looking through all of them. So just getting that alone, we were seeing trials come up. And then during the whole process, the nice thing is we cover a pretty broad scope in our book. So whenever this happened, we tried to make it a associated reference to still keep a nod to where things are current and keep our data as relevant as possible to the clinicians reading our book. Um, but yeah, we weren't able to add chapters after that, despite the temptation.
John, any thought on it?
Oh, I would just echo what Hunter said about how much work Susanna put into the part of it. And also to say, you mentioned that Haresh Kirpalani and Barbara Schmidt were on the editorial team for this. And as you're seeing in this interview, there are lots of different opinions and perspectives. And when we add in the expertise and immense experience of Haresh and Barbara, you can imagine that the selection of studies and the entertainment of new studies that should maybe trump another one, as you said, was a very active discussion. So as it would be if you put any 5 clinicians into a room and said, what do you want to talk about for Journal Club?
So I guess I don't know if that actually happened, but I feel like we all have studies that we truly love. Like there's some papers that you're like, I live and die by this paper, and then I can't imagine strong neonatologist coming into a room and then allowing certain studies to be put under the microscope. So I'm just wondering if we could go around the room in the last few minutes that we have together, and you could tell us a little bit about which is, of all the studies present in the book, the one that you favor the most. Why is that? And maybe the study that was left out of the book that you really wish made it into the book.
well, I'll start with a beloved study while these guys
Okay.
think. I love the original cryo trial.
Interesting.
It came out during my fellowship. ROP was a disease that, if found, had no specific treatment and was just heartbreaking that we could do so little for it. My mentor, Jerry Lucy, and obviously Bill Silverman before, were so involved in this. So a breakthrough therapy. And then the innovation, randomizing eyes. Okay. And moving forward with that just struck me as so clever and thoughtful that they at least wanted, whatever the results were, they at least wanted one's eye to get the best treatment.
Can you clarify this for people, because I know what you're talking about, but what does that mean, randomizing the eye?
If you met criteria, if one eye was worse, that's the eye that got treated if you were randomized to treatment. If they were similar, you got randomized to left eye or right eye. So it was just so thoughtful about what are the consequences downstream. We have equipoise. We don't know if this will work. And it was thoughtful and clever. And of course, because it worked and changed our practice and changed what we could share with families about this, has always been very close to my heart. So Dale Phelps, her crew who did that, I've always had great admiration for.
Who wants to take the next one?
I'll jump with the next study that really captivated me. I'm also probably biased because I had such a fun interview with Dr. Bartlett, but I absolutely loved the randomized play the winner ECMO trial. I thought just the setting in which he performed it, and then the thoughtfulness of finding this very unusual design at the time to try to test this potentially life-saving therapy where equipoise was rapidly being lost, and try to actually generate some data around it was fascinating.
Bartlett was the most unbelievable
He was
interview.
so cool.
About all the other things he did as well. But here's a surgeon who came up with this adaptive design because he kept getting the criticism that the observational work he had done didn't convince anyone. And then interestingly, such a powerful therapy, what is it, Suzanne, only 11
Yeah, it
patients
was
or 12
12
patients,
total, 11 treated with ECMO.
wound up in the study. And it's poo-pooed in a way because of that. But in fact, it clearly shows it works. It doesn't show safety with 12 patients. But yes, I agree. That was a great experience.
Yeah, and he was such a great kind of thinker and example of collaboration too, because he talked about, the scathing reviews he got after this, because it's such a small study and quite the statement. And then he went on to do another study with one of his sharpest critics of that to try to work together. It was just such an amazing story.
Yeah, Ben, you got to get him on Incubator.
I like how he described the crazy and outrageous. I believe is that what in the commentary he said about the technique. I like it's like that sums it pretty well. John, what was your favorite article in the book?
I mean, there obviously it's if, like choosing children, I suppose.
Well, you've already narrowed down to 50 studies, and now I'm asking you even a bigger question.
Oh,
Be like,
that's fair.
tell me
That's
the
fair
one.
enough. It's fair enough. I think the one that has always stood out to me because of its intellectual integrity regarding the idea of a trial was also from the surgeons, who are sometimes criticized for not being as committed as they should be, but to trials. But it was the mom's trial of in utero meningobilocele repair that, and the reason I chose that is that they decided as a community basically to stop using a therapy unless it was in a trial design. And I think that was really an impressive thing to do. If you think about how often the proverbial horse gets out of the barn with therapies, for which we have very low certainty of evidence before that evidence accumulates, here was a group who said, okay, we're gonna make sure we do this study, and we're gonna, it's going to be what it is, but at least we'll have better guidance about whether this is the right thing to do at the end of it. So I really liked that commitment, and it stood out for me.
Yeah, and there was a lot at stake with that particular intervention. I think that the balance between outcomes and prematurity is something that was definitely in the balance, and yeah, I think it's definitely yeah. My favorite trial I think will remain the skin to skin from Colombia. I think that I'm just so enamored by the simplicity of the intervention and the effect. I think it's just I think that for the sake of being impartial, I had to mention what my favorite study was. I guess that we are close to the end. My next question is going to be, when is the second edition coming out? Susanna is laughing. Go
Oh
ahead,
my
Susanna.
gosh, this project was just such a joy, I think, for the entire team to get together and write, that we're itching to figure out kind of the next project, and we are tickled to see all these new studies coming out with the hope of writing another edition. So we're certainly hoping to do something. I don't think we've settled on what's the next move yet.
The
You're
other
the
thing
Yeah.
that would, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say Susanna is the only one with a big smile on her face. You two were not smiling as as widely.
No, I can't wait. I enjoyed this process, being invited in on this process by John and Susanna so much. Um, and it'll be interesting. We need to think about what the next angle is, that will serve the community's interests.
One of the things that I think would be interesting in going backwards is to think about non-randomized trials. But the trouble there is that there are, 100,000 of those probably, but understanding what the pathway was from establishing the link between surfactant and RDS in premature babies through to having a therapy available only, Roger, 20 years later or so. That would be, that's very interesting too, extending the question asking before you get to the human experimentation part. Would be interesting.
Something about the rationale, then, the studies that made the rationale. We'll talk about it, Ben.
But we have so many different angles. We also, our book ended up getting picked up by some parents too. We got some feedback later as well, which was fun and exciting. And I mean, largely it is targeted towards clinicians, but it was also something where you sense there's some need for that too. So we play a little bit about thinking about how we can bring some of this to parents.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be, in my opinion, the next frontier for neonatology, and it's already been well investigated. But the role that parents will play both in study design, study process, and then analysis is key. I'm just curious, what kind of feedback did parents give you on the book? That must have been terrifying.
They actually loved it. One
Great.
of the ones that contacted me was a historian. So he really enjoyed kind of going through and seeing how things had come about, which was fun. Um, I mean, I don't think they were looking as
For
much at the
trainees,
trial
can you
design
imagine if a
aspects,
parent
but
read the book and comes into rounds prepared? Oof, this is a terrifying proposition.
Maybe it's a job for AI guys. Have them feed the book in and have them print our chapters out in readable forms at a 10th grade level.
We're going to. It's a very interesting point you're making, Roger. This is a subject we're going to address at the upcoming Delphi conference. Talking a little bit about the use that AI can do, not just in making helping clinicians with decision, but maybe helping the relationship between clinicians and parents. So I think you're right on the money. There's tremendous opportunities, in my opinion, that could be explored. Yes, John.
Can I just make one more point before we
Please.
go? Because I think you were about to wrap up, but I wanted to make sure to underline something that Roger said at the very beginning, which was that we edited this, and we've been talking a lot about the discussions that we had, but each chapter was actually written. The hard work was actually done by a group of really impressive individuals who were willing to wade in and put their thoughts on paper, and who are, as Roger said, in many cases trialists or data synthesis people on their own. So I just wanted to really thank them and make sure it was understood that all we were doing was corralling their ideas into a book.
I picked up the book at some random times of the day or night, and sometimes I even got full. I'm like, did that person write that? Oh no, he's not the PI. He is the editor of this particular section. But the list is too long, in my opinion, to go through. But the list of names, like you said, Nick Embleton, Sarah DiMauro, like there's a list. Shuvik Mitra, there's Brian King. There's a long list of contributors that is of I don't exactly know how you got such a high quality group of people together and to collaborate, but it is very impressive. Prakash Ravid Patel. I mean, it's a long list. So yeah, congratulations, and I think it's important to mention this before we wrap up. Susanna, John, Roger, thank you so much for being on the show and sharing this short hour with us. The book is called 50 Studies Every Neonatologist Should Know. You can grab a copy on Amazon. You can get it in Kindle format. You can get it at hard copy. So we'll put some links in the description. Congratulations, and we're looking forward to the next edition.
Thank you so much for having us, Ben.
Thank you.